Chapter 1. The air in the subterranean vault of the Ivory Exchange tasted of ozone and expensive filtration. Skye sat on a velvet stool inside a reinforced glass cube, his hands bound by silk-lined restraints that bit into his wrists every time he shivered. He was dressed in a sheer floor-length robe of gossamer silk designed to be visually stunning, yet functionally useless against the cold. Ladies, gentlemen, and collectors of the impossible, the auctioneer's voice boomed, amplified to a smooth, oily purr. For 300 years, the sandalwood and ghost lily lineage was considered a myth, a fabrication of historical romance. Tonight, we prove that legends can be bled. The auctioneer stepped towards Skye's enclosure and tapped a clinical-looking brass valve. The suppressors are coming off. Skye gasped, his eyes widening as the heavy, scent-blocking collar around his neck hissed and clicked open. For the first time in weeks, his biology surged. It started as a ripple, a scent that shouldn't exist in a world of synthetic musks and industrial alphas. It was deep, earthy sandalwood, layered with a floral note so piercingly sweet it felt like a physical ache in the lungs. It didn't just drift, it claimed the room. In the darkened gallery, men leaned forward, pupils dilated. The low, predatory growls of alphas began to vibrate against the glass. Starting bid, the auctioneer shouted over the rising tension. 50 million. 100. A voice called from the shadows. 120. 150. Skye squeezed his eyes shut, the overwhelming sensory input of 100 alphas' lust hitting him like a tidal wave. He felt like a piece of meat being torn apart by eyes alone. Then the heavy steel reinforced doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges. The sound was a thunderclap that silenced the bidding war instantly. A plume of smoke rolled into the gold-leafed room, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots. Boss Nero stepped through the haze. He wasn't dressed for an auction. He was dressed for a massacre. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, but his shirt was open at the collar, revealing a glimpse of a scarred chest. He didn't carry a paddle. He carried a customized silver .45, and his presence an overwhelming tweet. An overwhelming, suffocating scent of rain-soaked asphalt and bitter cedar crushed the room's collective libido like a lead weight. "The auction is over," Nero said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who owned the city's graveyards. "Nero," the auctioneer stammered, backing away from Skye's cage. "You're breaking the neutrality pact." "This Omega is this Omega," Nero interrupted. "Stepping up to the glass cube is a violation of international law. And more importantly, he's making my head ache." Nero raised his weapon. With 3 deafening shots, the reinforced glass spiderwebbed and shattered, raining diamonds of safety glass onto the velvet floor. Skye flinched, shielding his face, but a heavy, warm weight settled over his shoulders. He looked up to see Nero standing over him, having draped his own suit jacket around Skye's shivering frame. For a second, their eyes met. Nero's pupils weren't blown wide with lust like the others. They were sharp, focused, and dangerously intelligent. He leaned down, his nose brushing against the pulse point of Skye's neck, where the ghost lily scent was strongest. Nero stiffened. A low, primal rumble started deep in his chest, not of hunger, but of recognition. "So the legends weren't lying," Nero whispered, his hand gripping Skye's chin with terrifying gentleness. "You really are the last one." He turned back to the room, his gun leveled at the stunned crowd. "He's coming with me. Anyone who has a problem with the loss of their deposit can file a complaint at the bottom of the river." Nero hauled Skye up, tucking the smaller man firmly against his side. As they walked out through the wreckage, Skye realized the terrifying truth. He had been traded from a cage of glass to a cage of iron. Chapter 2. The interior of Nero's armored SUV smelled of expensive leather and the lingering, sharp ozone of a discharged firearm. Outside, the city blurred into a streak of neon rain, but inside, the silence was suffocating. Skye huddled in the corner of the back seat, swallowed by Nero's oversized suit jacket. The scent of rain-soaked asphalt, Nero's personal signature, clung to the fabric, acting as a strange, grounding anchor against the dizzying sweetness of his own unmasked pheromones. Nero sat across from him, cleaning the barrel of his sidearm with a silk cloth. He didn't look up, but his presence filled the cabin like a physical weight. "The ghost lily," Nero said suddenly, his voice a low vibration that made the glass rattle. In the old texts, they said the scent could stop in Alpha's heart. I always thought it was poetic hyperbole, till 5 minutes ago. Skye's voice was a dry rasp. "Is that why you took me? To see if my heart stops yours?" Nero finally looked up. His eyes were a piercing, stormy gray. "I took you because if I hadn't, that room would have turned into a bloodbath within the hour. Alphas don't bid on a legend. Skye, they kill for it." They pulled into a sprawling estate hidden behind 10-foot reinforced concrete walls and thermal sensors. This wasn't a home. It was a black site bunker disguised as a mansion. Nero led him into a sleek, minimalist medical wing. Waiting there was a woman in a white lab coat, her face a mask of professional indifference until Skye stepped into the light. She physically recoiled, her hand flying to her nose. "God, Nero," she gasped. "The readings on the perimeter sensors are spiking." "He's loud." "Fix it, Elena," Nero commanded, leaning against the doorframe. "I can't fix a genetic lineage." "Boss, I can only muffle it." She pulled a sleek, matte black band from a sterilized case. It looked more like a piece of high-end tech jewelry than a collar. "This is a grade S pulse suppressor. It doesn't just block the scent. It uses microneedles to inject a steady stream of synthetic blockers into the scent glands." Skye flinched. Nero saw the tremor in his hands and stepped forward, his shadow falling over Skye. "It will hurt for a second," Nero said, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost gentle. "But without it, you are a beacon for every predator within a 5-mile radius. Do you want to be a person, or do you want to be prey?" Skye looked at the black band, then at Nero. "You're an alpha. Why aren't you affected?" Nero leaned down, his face inches from Skye's. The air between them hummed with static. "Who says I'm not? I'm just better at hiding the urge to tear the throat out of anyone who looks at you." Nero took the collar from the doctor. His large, calloused hands were surprisingly steady as he reached around Skye's neck. The heat radiating from Nero's body was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the cold clinical room. Click, the needles engaged. Skye gasped, his back arching as the blockers flooded his system. Slowly, the overwhelming floral haze in the room began to dissipate. The ghost lily was forced back into the shadows of his biology. "Better?" Nero asked, his thumb lingering for a fraction of a second on the edge of the collar, brushing against Skye's jaw. Skye nodded weakly, leaning into the touch before he could stop himself. "Why save me? You're a crime lord. You could have sold me for twice what they were bidding." Nero straightened up, his expression returning to its usual impenetrable stone. "Because a legend is only valuable if it's rare," Nero said, turning toward the door. "And I don't like sharing my things. Welcome to your new life, Skye. Try not to break anything, especially my patience." As the heavy door locked behind him, Skye realized that while the glass cage was gone, the iron one had just been bolted shut. Chapter 3. The medical wing was replaced by a suite that felt more like a 5-star prison. Floor 2 ceiling windows of ballistic glass overlooked a rain-slicked courtyard where men in tactical gear patrolled with silent, lupin efficiency. Skye sat on the edge of a silk-sheeted bed, his fingers ghosting over the matte black suppressor collar. The synthetic blockers made his veins feel like they were filled with cold mercury. A dull ache that reminded him he was no longer loud, but he was no longer himself either. The door hissed open. Nero entered, having traded his tactical gear for a crisp black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He carried a tablet and a tray with a single glass of amber liquid and a plate of high-protein food. "Eat," Nero commanded, setting the tray on a mahogany desk. "You've lost 3 pounds since the auction." "My doctor doesn't like treating malnourished assets." "Asset," Skye repeated, his voice small but edged with a spark of defiance. "Is that what I am? A line on a ledger." Nero pulled out a chair, turning it backward to sit and face Skye. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes betraying the war he was fighting to keep the collectors at bay. In this city, everyone is an asset or an obstacle. "Skye, right now, you're an asset I'm bleeding money to keep alive." Nero tapped the tablet, projecting a holographic map of the city's shipping docks. Red dots flickered across the screen, locations of the syndicate's known transit hubs. The men who had you. They weren't just traffickers. They're part of a conglomerate called the Ouroboros. "They don't just sell people, they harvest them," Nero said, his eyes tracking Skye's reaction. "I'm going to dismantle them, not out of the goodness of my heart, but because they're encroaching on my territory. I need names. Faces the man who handled your conditioning before the auction." Skye shuddered. The memory of the handler, a man with clinical eyes and a silver cane, made the ghost lily scent flare briefly. And phantom floral note that even the collar couldn't fully suppress. Nero's nostrils flared. He leaned in, his own alpha scent, that heavy, grounding rain and cedar, thickening as if to shield Skye from his own memories. "Tell me, Skye, and I'll make sure he never sees the sun again." Skye looked into Nero's eyes. He saw the brutality there, but he also saw a strange, localized honor. Nero wasn't a hero, but he was a wall. "His name is Vane," Skye whispered. "He has a laboratory in the industrial district. He spoke about distilling the lineage. He wanted to see if the scent stayed in the blood after the heart stopped." Nero's jaw tightened so hard a muscle leaped in his cheek. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. As Nero turned to leave, Skye stood up, his hand catching Nero's sleeve. It was a bold move, an omega touching a dominant alpha without permission, and both of them froze. Nero looked down at the pale hand against his black cuff. He didn't pull away. "Why do you smell like that?" Skye asked softly. "Everyone else, the alphas, at the auction. They smelled like rot and hunger, but you smell like home after a storm." Nero's expression shifted. For a fleeting second, the boss vanished, replaced by a man who looked profoundly lonely. He reached out, his large hand hovering near Skye's face before settling on his shoulder. He didn't grip. He simply let the weight of his hand ground the trembling omega. "It's just pheromones, Skye. Don't mistake a predator's territory marking for comfort." "Is that all this is?" Skye challenged, stepping closer into Nero's space. "Territory." Nero's eyes darkened, the gray turning to charcoal. He leaned down, his breath warm against Skye's ear. "If I were just marking territory, you'd be screaming, not asking questions. Eat your dinner. Tomorrow, we start your training. If you're going to be the last of your kind, you're going to learn how to bite back." Nero exited, the lock clicking with a finality that felt less like a prison and more like a promise. Chapter 4. The storm outside the bunker mirrored the one inside Skye's mind. High-dosage suppressors were supposed to kill the dreams, but the ghost lily lineage was ancient, rooted deeper than modern chemistry could reach. In the dead of night, the memory returned, the cold steel of the auctioneer's table, the sterile scent of Vane's laboratory, and the feeling of being hunted. Skye thrashed in the silk sheets, his skin slick with sweat, his heart rate spiked, triggering a biological override. The collar humped, its needles working overtime. But the sheer emotional distress forced a leak. A concentrated, ethereal burst of sandalwood and ghost lily began to seep from his pores, thick enough to mist the air. At the security hub, the air filtration alarms began to wail. Nero, who hadn't slept in 48 hours, stood over a map of Vane's warehouses. He didn't need the alarms to tell him what was happening. His own biology reacted first, a tightening in his chest, a sudden, jagged need to protect. He moved through the hallways like a ghost, his heavy boots silent on the carpet. When he palmed the door to Skye's suite open, the scent hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just a smell. It was a psychic weight, a sorrowful, ancient plea for safety. "Skye," Nero growled, his voice thick. Skye didn't wake. He was trapped in a REM cycle of terror, his body arching off the bed. The scent was becoming dangerously potent. If any other alpha on the grounds caught this, the fortress would turn into an arena. Nero crossed the room in 3 strides. He should have called the medic. He should have dialed up the suppressor's dosage remotely. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and hauled Skye's shaking body into his lap. "Wake up," Nero commanded, but his hands were surprisingly tender as they cupped Skye's face. Skye let out a broken sob, his eyes snapping open. They were blown wide, seeing Vane instead of Nero. He fought, his small fists thudding against Nero's rock-solid chest. "No, don't touch, don't take it, Skye. Look at me." Nero grabbed Skye's wrists, pinning them gently but firmly to his own chest. "It's me. It's Nero. You're in the bunker. You're safe." Skye's focus snapped into place. He saw the sharp jawline, the stormy gray eyes, and felt the overwhelming heat of Nero's body. The panic began to recede, replaced by an agonizing vulnerability. "It's leaking," Skye whispered, his voice trembling. "The collar? It isn't enough." "I know," Nero said. He did something he had sworn never to do with an asset. He tucked Skye's head into the crook of his neck, the location of his own scent glands. Nero's scent, rain-soaked asphalt and bitter cedar, flooded Skye's senses. It was a dominant, grounding force that acted like a chemical blanket, smothering the ghost lily's frantic cry. Skye slumped against him, his hands clutching Nero's shirt, his nose pressed into the alpha's throat. For a long minute, they sat in the dark, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of 2 hearts trying to find a shared tempo. Nero's hand drifted up, his fingers tangling in Skye's hair, stroking the back of his head in a primitive nesting gesture that alphas usually reserved for bonded mates. Nero felt his own control fraying. The ghost lily scent was designed to make alphas lose their minds, but Nero's reaction wasn't purely hormonal. It was a protective fury so deep it scared him. "You're drugged to the gills, and you're still this loud," Nero muttered against Skye's hair, his voice a rough purr. "You're going to be the death of me, little bird." Skye pulled back just enough to look up at him. Their faces were inches apart. "You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm a prize to be won. Nero, why?" Nero's gaze dropped to Skye's lips, then back to his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be a weapon everyone wants to pull the trigger on. Now, sleep. I'm staying until the air clears." Nero didn't leave. He leaned back against the headboard, keeping Skye tucked against his side. As Skye finally drifted into a dreamless sleep, Nero realized the Shadow Protocol had failed. He wasn't just the Guardian anymore. He was the one being haunted. Chapter 5. The morning light in the bunker was artificial, a sterile blue that did nothing to warm the cold realization of the night before. Nero had vanished before Skye woke, but the lingering scent of rain and cedar on the pillows was a silent witness to the lines they had crossed. Skye found Nero in the subterranean training floor, a sprawling gym of black mats, reinforced glass, and high-tech firing ranges. Nero was mid-workout, his shirt discarded, his back a map of scars and jagged tattoos. He was hitting a heavy bag with a rhythmic, bone-deep thud that echoed like a heartbeat. "You're late," Nero grunted without turning around. He landed a final, punishing hook that sent the heavy bag swinging wildly. "I didn't know I had a schedule," Skye replied, his voice steadier than he felt. He was dressed in charcoal gray athletic gear, provided by Alina, the fabric clinging to his lean frame. Nero wiped sweat from his brow with a towel and turned, his gaze sweeping over Skye with a clinical intensity that made Skye's skin prickle. The collectors landed at the private airfield an hour ago. 3 of them, high-tier alphas with diplomatic immunity and more money than God. They aren't here for a tour. They're here for you. Nero stepped onto the sparring mat and beckoned Skye forward. If they get past my men, if they get past me, you need to know how to kill. Not struggle, not scream. Kill. I've never even held a gun, Nero, Skye said, stepping onto the mat. Then we start with the body. Nero moved with the grace of a panther, suddenly appearing in Skye's personal space. He grabbed Skye's wrist, twisting it just enough to show the vulnerability of the joint. Your scent is your curse, but it's also your distraction. If an alpha gets close enough to smell you, they lose a fraction of a second to focus. That's when you strike. For the next 3 hours, Nero was a relentless taskmaster. He pushed Skye until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed. He taught him how to find the soft pulse of the throat, the delicate structure of the windpipe, and the pressure points that could drop a man twice his size. Again, Nero commanded, pinning Skye against the padded wall. Their chests heaved in unison. Skye was exhausted, his frustration boiling over. I can't. I'm an Omega, Nero. My biology is built to submit, not to fight you. Nero's hand shifted from Skye's shoulder to his jaw, forcing Skye to look him in the eye. Biology is a suggestion. Skye, your lineage didn't survive for centuries by being submissive. It survived because it was deadly. The ghost lily doesn't just attract, it paralyzes. Use it. The collar focus, beneath the blockers. Find the spike in your adrenaline and channel it. Skye closed his eyes. He reached past the chemical cold of the suppressor, tapping into the raw terror of the auction and the burgeoning heat he felt for the man standing over him. A thin, sharp cord of sandalwood sliced through the air, a needle of scent so concentrated it made Nero's pupils contract into slits. Nero flinched, his grip loosening for a split second. Skye seized the moment, driving his elbow into Nero's ribs and slipping under his arm. Nero recovered instantly, a dark, dangerous smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Better. You might actually survive the week. The moment was shattered by the buzz of Nero's comes. It was his head of security, his voice tight. Boss, we have a problem. The collectors just sent a gift to the front gate. It's a box, and it's leaking your lieutenant's scent. Nero's expression went stone cold. The mentor vanished, replaced by the warlord. Go to your room, Skye. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me, Nero said, reaching for his shirt and his weapon. Nero? That wasn't a request. Nero paused at the exit, his silhouette framed by the harsh gym lights. The shadow protocol is in effect. If the perimeter falls, my men have orders to extract you. Follow them. As Nero strode away, Skye felt the weight of the legend heavier than ever. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was the center of a war that was about to turn his gilded cage into a front line. Chapter 6. The box at the gate had been a warning. A shredded piece of Nero's lieutenant's jacket, soaked in a synthetic neutralizer that erased an alpha scent. It was a psychological strike, a message that the collectors could strip a man of his identity before they stripped him of his life. The tension in the bunker was a living thing, vibrating in the walls. Nero had been a ghost for 3 days, coordinating a counterstrike that had the city's underworld holding its breath. When he finally appeared in Skye's suite, he wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He was wearing a simple black cashmere sweater and dark jeans. Get dressed, Nero said. He tossed a heavy, hooded parka onto the bed, something nondescript. We're leaving. The collector's Skye started, glancing at the security monitors. The collectors expect me to hunker down and fortify, Nero interrupted, his eyes tracking the movement of Skye's hands. They don't expect me to take a walk in the rain. We're going off-grid for 4 hours. If I stay in this cage any longer, I'm going to start killing my own men just for breathing too loud. They slipped out through a service tunnel. Entering a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away, Nero drove himself, weaving through the neon-soaked labyrinth of the lower districts where the rain washed the sins into the gutters. They ended up at a small hole-in-the-wall noodle bar tucked under a train trestle. The steam from the giant pots blurred the windows, and the smell of toasted sesame and chili oil provided a much-needed veil. "Nobody here knows who I am," Nero muttered, sliding into a cramped wooden booth. He sat closer than necessary, his thigh pressing against Skye's. "And nobody here cares about a legendary lineage. To them, you're just a beautiful boy in a coat too big for him." For the first time since the auction, Skye felt the crushing weight of the Ghost Lily lift. Under the heavy hood and the scent blockers, he was just. "Skye, why this place?" Skye asked, watching Nero navigate a pair of chopsticks with surprising grace. Nero paused, a rare reflective look softening his sharp features. "My mother used to bring me here before the syndicate recruited me. Back when my only job was to be a kid, not a kingpin. I come here when I need to remember what I'm actually fighting for." They shared a bowl of spicy ramen, the heat of the food and the proximity of their bodies creating a bubble of intimacy. Skye found himself laughing at a dry, biting comment Nero made about a politician on the overhead TV. It was a sound Nero hadn't heard before. Clear, musical, and utterly devoid of fear. Nero froze, his gaze dropping to Skye's mouth. The rain and cedar scent intensified, turning warm and smoky. "You shouldn't do that," Nero whispered. "What?" "Laugh." "Sound like you trust me," Nero said, his hand reaching under the table to grip Skye's knee. The touch was possessive, a silent claim. "I'm a violent man, Skye. I've done things that would make your blood run cold. Don't make the mistake of thinking I'm a hero." Skye didn't flinch. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching Nero's. "The heroes let me be sold. The violent man is the only one who saw me as a person. I'll take my chances with the monster who feeds me ramen." The moment was broken by a subtle shift in the air. Across the street, a black SUV with tinted windows slowed to a crawl. Nero's internal alarm, honed by years of survival, went off instantly. "Don't look," Nero commanded, his voice returning to its steel plate resonance. He reached into his jacket, his hand finding the grip of his weapon. "Stay behind me. When we exit, you run for the car. Do not stop. Do not look back." The taste of normalcy was over. The hunters had found the scent, even through the rain and the suppressors. "Nero," Skye whispered, his hand tightening on the Alpha's arm. "I've got you," Nero growled, his eyes locking onto the SUV as the door began to open. "Always." Chapter 7. The SUV door didn't just open. It was kicked out by a man wearing a tactical rebreather. The collectors weren't just wealthy alphas. They were a paramilitary force. "Go," Nero roared, shoving Skye toward the back exit of the noodle bar, just as the first spray of suppressed gunfire shattered the storefront's steaming pots. Shards of ceramic and boiling broth exploded into the air. Nero didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his silver .45 barking twice, dropping the lead merc before the man could clear the vehicle. But there were more. 3 black vans screeched into the narrow alleyway, boxing them in. They scrambled through the kitchen and into a rain-slicked back alley. Nero was a whirlwind of violent precision, but the sheer numbers were against them. As they reached their sedan, a sniper's round from a nearby rooftop punched through the car's shoulder pillar and grazed Nero's side. Nero grunted, stumbling against the door. Red bloomed instantly against his black sweater. "Nero!" Skye lunged for him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Get in the car, Skye. Drive." Nero shoved the keys into Skye's hand, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a terrifying, protective light. He leaned against the frame, drawing a second magazine. He intended to stay behind and hold the line. "I'm not leaving you," Skye screamed. The mercenaries were closing in, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles. They didn't even have their weapons raised anymore. They were moving in for the capture, confident that the Alpha was neutralized. Skye looked at Nero's blood, then at the approaching men. Something snapped. The submissive biology Nero had mocked earlier didn't just break, it inverted. Skye reached up and ripped the matte black suppressor collar from his neck. The needles tore at his skin, leaving for thin tracks of blood, but the relief was instantaneous. Without the chemical dampeners, the sandalwood and ghost lily scent didn't just drift, it detonated. It hit the alleyway like a physical shockwave. It was beautiful, cloying, and utterly overwhelming. To an Alpha, it felt like being plunged into a vat of liquid gold that suddenly turned into lead in their lungs. The mercenaries stumbled. One dropped his rifle, his hands clawing at his throat as his brain short-circuited under the sheer hormonal overload. Their pupils dilated until their eyes were solid black, their predatory instincts warring with a sudden, paralyzing euphoria. Nero, now. Skye grabbed Nero's arm, hauling the larger man into the passenger seat. Skye scrambled into the driver's side. He had never driven a high-performance vehicle, but adrenaline guided his hands. He slammed the car into gear and floored it, the tires screaming as they peeled out of the alley, leaving the incapacitated mercenaries wandering in a daze, drugged by the very scent they had been hired to steal. As they tore onto the main highway, the scent in the car became a thick, intoxicating fog. Nero was slumped against the seat, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He looked at Skye, really looked at him, his eyes unfocused but filled with a new kind of awe. You pulled the collar," Nero rasped, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the bleeding marks on Skye's neck. "I told you. You were deadly." "Shut up and hold your side," Skye commanded, his voice shaking but firm. "I'm getting us to the safe house." Skye's scent was still filling the cabin, a siren song that made Nero's heart race dangerously fast. For the first time, the boss wasn't the one in control. Chapter 8. The safe house was a cabin of cedar and reinforced steel, buried deep in a coastal forest where the sound of the crashing Pacific swallowed the noise of the world. By the time Skye pulled the SUV into the hidden garage, the interior of the car was a sensory fever dream. Without the collar, Skye's scent had matured, shifting from a plea to a roar. Nero was barely conscious, his face a ghostly gray. The bullet had grooved his side, not deep enough to kill a man of his stature, but the blood loss and the proximity to Skye's unmasked pheromones had short-circuited his alpha composure. Skye hauled Nero's massive arm over his shoulder, gritting his teeth against the weight. He managed to get him to a low-slung leather sofa in the center of the cabin. The air here was cold, smelling of pine and salt, but as soon as Skye moved, the sandalwood and ghost lily began to claim the space. "Medicine. Cabinet, kitchen," Nero rasped, his eyes fluttering. Even in his haze, his hand instinctively reached for Skye's waist, pulling him closer. "You shouldn't be out of the collar. It's dangerous. You're the one bleeding out, and you're still trying to boss me around?" Skye snapped, though his hands shook as he tore open Nero's ruined cashmere sweater. Skye found the trauma kit. He had watched the medics at the bunker enough to know the basics. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic, his heart leaping every time Nero hissed in pain. To any other alpha, Skye's scent at this concentration would be an invitation to a frenzy. To Nero, it seemed to be the only thing keeping him tethered to the living. As Skye pressed a hemostatic gauze to the wound, Nero's hand shot up, gripping Skye's wrist. It wasn't the bone-crushing grip of the boss. It was the desperate clutch of a drowning man. "Skye?" Nero breathed. His pupils were blown wide, black ink swallowing the gray. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Skye's sternum, inhaling sharply. Your scent. It's changing. It's not leaking anymore, Nero, Skye said softly, his fingers tentatively brushing the sweat-damp hair back from Nero's forehead. I'm not hiding it. Not from you. The dynamic in the room shifted. The fortress was gone. There were no guards, no monitors, no syndicate. Just a wounded predator and the legend he had tried to cage. Skye realized then that Nero wasn't just his protector. He was the only man who had ever looked at the ghost lily and seen the soul beneath it. Why did you stop me from turning myself in? Skye whispered, his face inches from Nero's. You could have ended the war. You could have stayed safe. Nero looked up, his gaze heavy with a raw, terrifying honesty. Because the thought of you in a lab, the thought of someone else's mark on your neck. He let out a low, jagged growl. I'd rather burn this entire city to the ground than let them touch you. Is it the scent, Nero? Skye challenged, his voice dropping to a silken thread. Do you want the legend, or do you want me? Nero didn't answer with words. He reached up, his large hand cupping the back of Skye's neck, right where the suppressor needles had left their marks. He pulled Skye down into a kiss that tasted of copper, rain, and the desperate, high-stakes reality of their lives. It wasn't a kiss of submission or dominance. It was a collision. In that moment, Skye realized he wasn't the only one who was the last of his kind. Nero, with his brutal honor and his lonely heart, was just as much an endangered species. Chapter 9. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the cedar walls of the cabin. Outside, the Pacific gale howled, but inside, the air was heavy, sweet, and still. Nero lay against the pillows Skye had propped up, his torso wrapped in white bandages that stood out starkly against his tanned, scarred skin. Skye sat on the floor by the sofa, his head resting against Nero's hip. The suppressor collar sat discarded on the coffee table like a broken shackle. Without it, the sandalwood and ghost lily had settled into a calm, rhythmic pulse, matching the steady beat of their hearts. You asked me once, Nero began, his voice raspy and stripped of its usual command, why I don't smell like the others. Why I don't look at you like a prize. Skye looked up, his chin resting on the edge of the leather cushion. I remember. Nero stared into the flames, his gray eyes reflecting the orange glow. I wasn't born a boss. I was born into a syndicate breeding program. My father was a high-tier alpha, and my mother. She was a woman they bought because her genetics promised a soldier. I was raised in a concrete room with 10 other boys. We weren't taught to read, we were taught to kill. He let out a dry, bitter laugh. They used synthetic pheromones to drive us into frenzies. They wanted to see who would survive the madness. By the time I was 16, I was the only one left. I had killed my brothers, Skye. Not because I hated them, but because the chemicals told me to. Skye reached up, his fingers interlacing with Nero's large, calloused hand. The touch was a silent anchor. That's why I built the bunker. Why I run this city, Nero continued, his grip tightening on Skye's hand. I hated the loss of control. I spent my whole life building walls so no one, no chemical, no scent, no alpha could ever make me a slave to my instincts again. Nero turned his head to look at Skye. For the first time, the monster looked human. Then I smelled you at that auction. It wasn't like the synthetics. It didn't make me want to tear the room apart. It made me want to stop. Stop what? Skye whispered. Stop fighting. Stop being the wall, Nero said, his voice dropping to a vulnerable depth. Your scent. It's the only thing that has ever made me feel like I wasn't just a weapon. It's not the legend I want, Skye. It's the peace I find when I'm near you. I didn't save you to own you. I saved you because you're the only thing in this world that makes me feel like I actually have a soul left to save. Skye felt a lump form in his throat. He moved, rising to his knees so he was eye level with Nero. He saw the scars on Nero's chest, some from bullets, some from the very program he had described. Then stop being the wall for a minute, Skye said. He leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the pulse point on Nero's neck, right where the rain and cedar was strongest. Nero groaned, a low, primal sound of surrender. He reached out, his hands framing Skye's face with a reverence that bordered on worship. If we do this, if I mark you, the syndicate will never stop. You won't just be a legend, you'll be the queen of a war zone. I've spent my life being a victim of my blood, Skye replied, his eyes burning with a newfound fire. I'd rather be a target by your side than a ghost in a cage. As they pulled each other close in the dim light of the cabin, the ghost lily and the asphalt finally merged, creating a scent that wasn't a legend or a weapon, it was a bond. Chapter 10. The peace of the coastal cabin was shattered, not by a bullet, but by a vibration. Nero's encrypted satellite phone, resting on the cedar bedside table, buzzed with a rhythmic, insistent hum that felt like a death knell. Nero, still bandaged, but moving with a grim, renewed energy, picked it up. His face, which had softened in the firelight of the previous night, hardened back into a mask of cold granite. "Speak," Nero commanded. A voice crackled through, distorted, layered with digital interference. "Boss, they found the secondary transport. We were moving the files to the vault. They didn't want the data, boss. They wanted a message." Nero's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Where is Jocks? They took him, publicly, in the middle of the financial district. They left a scent bomb in his wake. Synthetic ghost lily. The enforcers are already crawling all over the scene." A new signal overrode the line. The distortion cleared, replaced by a voice that sounded like velvet over broken glass. It was the main collector, the shadow director of the Global Scent Syndicate. "Nero, you've been a very expensive thorn in our side," the collector purred. "But even a king needs his hand. We have your lieutenant. He's currently being processed. If you want him back, if you want your city to stop smelling like a crime scene, you have 12 hours to bring the legend to the old pier. No guards, no guns, just the boy." The line went dead. Nero slammed the phone onto the table, the screen shattering. He turned away from Skye, his broad shoulders heaving as he fought the alpha rage threatening to boil over. Skye stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He had heard enough. Jocks. He's the one who's been with you since the beginning, isn't he? The one who helped you build the bunker? He's the only man I trust with my life. Nero growled, his back still turned. And they know it. They're using my own loyalty against me. Skye walked over, placing a hand on Nero's trembling shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and ghost lily flared, not in fear, but in a sharp, metallic resolve. "They don't just want me, Nero. They want to break you. If you give me up, you lose everything you fought for. If you don't, you lose your brother." Nero whirled around, grabbing Skye's arms. His eyes were wild. "I am not trading you. I will burn the syndicate to the ground before I let them put a leash back on you." "Then stop fighting them like a boss," Skye said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "Start fighting them like a legend. They want a trade, let's give them one. But I'm not going as a prisoner." Nero looked at Skye, seeing the fire in the Omega's eyes. This wasn't the trembling boy from the auction. This was a partner. "What are you saying?" Nero asked. "You told me my scent could paralyze them," Skye said, reaching for the discarded suppressor collar on the table. He didn't put it on. He crushed the electronic casing under the heel of his boot. "We use the trade as a distraction. You gather your army. I'll provide the siren call. By the time they realize I'm the weapon and not the prize, it'll be too late." Nero stared at him, a dark, proud smile finally breaking through his fury. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against Skye's. "It's a suicide mission, Skye." "No," Skye whispered, his hands sliding up to Nero's neck. "It's an extinction event." As they began to prep their gear, the bounty on Nero's head tripled across the dark web. The Global Scent Syndicate thought they were calling a bluff. They didn't realize they had just invited a hurricane to their front door. Chapter 11. The strategy was set, but the air in the cabin had changed. Nero was a whirlwind of maps, munitions, and encrypted comms, calling in every favor from the city's shadowed corners. He was building a wall of lead to protect Skye. But Skye saw the truth. As long as he was by Nero's side, Nero would always be fighting with one hand tied behind his back. As night fell over the Pacific, Skye watched Nero clean his rifle, the same silver-etched weapon that had shattered his glass cage. "I can't let you do it, Nero," Skye whispered, though Nero was too far away to hear. "If you go to that pier with me, they'll kill you the moment I'm in their hands. They don't want a trade. They want a trophy and a corpse." Skye waited until the early hours of the morning. When even a man as hypervigilant as Nero finally succumbed to a shallow, exhausted sleep on the sofa. Skye moved like a ghost. He didn't take a weapon. He took a heavy wool scarf and pressed it against his neck, saturating the fabric with the concentrated, building, unmasked essence of sandalwood and ghost lily. It was a concentrated dose of his soul, a sensory anchor left behind. He draped the scarf over Nero's chest. The scent would act as a natural sedative, deepening Nero's sleep just long enough for Skye to vanish. "You told me to be a weapon?" Skye murmured, leaning down to press a final, feather-like kiss to Nero's forehead. "Now watch me fire." Skye stepped out into the freezing rain, his scent blockers completely gone. He didn't call a cab. He walked to the main road and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled to the curb. The driver, an alpha with a heavy-duty filtered mask, didn't even need to step out. The air around Skye was so potent, the car's internal sensors were already screaming. "I'm the trait," Skye said, his voice cold and devoid of the fear that had once defined him. "Take me to the collector. If you touch me before we arrive, I'll stop my own heart. And all you'll have is a corpse that smells like nothing." The driver hesitated, visibly affected by the aura Skye radiated. Even through the filters, the ghost lily was a psychic pressure. He gestured for Skye to get in. Back at the cabin, the sun began to peek over the horizon. Nero bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the spot where Skye should have been. He found only the scarf. The scent hit him a heartbreakingly pure wave of Skye's devotion and his goodbye. Nero roared, a sound of pure, primal agony that echoed through the empty trees. He realized Skye hadn't run away to hide. He had run away to become the bait. Nero grabbed the scarf, wrapping it around his fist. His eyes weren't stormy gray anymore. They were the color of a dying star. "You think you can take him?" Nero snarled at the empty room, his voice a promise of the bloodbath to come. "You have no idea what you've just invited into your house." By the time Nero was mobilizing his fleet, Skye was being led onto a private jet. He wasn't being shackled. He was being treated like royalty, led by men who refused to look him in the eye for fear of falling under his spell. They were taking him to the Golden Aviary, the Syndicate's private island stronghold. As the jet took off, Skye looked down at the city. He wasn't a victim anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, and he was heading straight for the heart of the enemy. Chapter 12. The Golden Aviary was a masterpiece of architectural cruelty. A sprawling estate of white marble and reinforced glass perched on a private volcanic island in the Philippine Sea. It was beautiful, sterile, and smelled of absolutely nothing. A vacuum designed to highlight the arrival of a masterpiece. Skye was led through halls lined with rare, extinct flora, preserved in cryocases. He was no longer wearing the oversized parka. The Syndicate had provided a robe of liquid gold silk that clung to his frame, leaving his neck and wrists bare. They wanted nothing between his skin and the air. At the heart of the estate was a solarium overlooking the churning ocean. There sat the main collector. He was an older alpha, his hair silver, his eyes covered by specialized haptic lenses that filtered out the visual shimmer of omega pheromones. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a curator. Do you know why the ghost lily went extinct, Skye? The collector asked, not looking up from a petri dish he was examining. It wasn't because it was weak. It was because it was too honest. It told every predator in the jungle exactly where it was. It invited its own destruction. It didn't invite it, Skye said, his voice echoing in the glass room. It just didn't care who was watching. The collector stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached Skye, stopping just outside the kill zone of Skye's unmasked scent. Even with his filters, the alpha's hand trembled slightly as he reached out with a glass vial. Nero thinks he's protecting a person. I know better. You are a chemical symphony. My labs will distill you. We will map the sequence of your sandalwood notes, synthesize the ghost lily's paralyzing edge, and sell it to the highest bidders. You won't be a legend anymore, Skye. You'll be a commodity. And, Nero? Skye asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nero is currently navigating a minefield of his own making. The collector smiled, a thin paper cut of a grin. He's a blunt instrument. He thinks he can storm this island with lead and fire. He doesn't realize that by the time he steps foot on these docks, you will already be processed. A shell, the collector signaled to 2 guards, alphas wearing heavy-duty military-grade rebreathers. They stepped forward, carrying a medical chair equipped with needle leads. We'll start with a full blood draw, the collector murmured. Don't fight it. The more you struggle, the more your scent spikes, and the more contaminants enter the sample. As they forced Skye into the chair, he didn't scream, he didn't beg. He closed his eyes and thought of the cabin. He thought of the smell of rain and cedar on the scarf he had left for Nero. He realized that the collector was wrong about one thing. The ghost lily didn't just tell predators where it was, it signaled the end of the forest. Skye leaned back, his eyes snapping open. They weren't soft or submissive. They were cold. You want my scent? Skye whispered, a dark, dangerous edge to his voice. Then take all of it. He didn't just let the scent leak, he forced it. He pushed his adrenaline to the breaking point, overriding the natural dampers of his body. The air in the solarium thickened instantly, the floral note turning from sweet to acrid, from cloying to suffocating. The alarms in the room began to wail. Ozone saturation high. Pheromone toxicity detected. The collector stumbled back, his haptic lenses cracking under the sheer bioelectric pressure Skye was emitting. Outside, on the horizon, the first of Nero's Black Ops helicopters broke through the clouds. The siege hadn't just begun. The prey had finally turned into the poison. Chapter 13. The horizon didn't just break up, it shattered. 3 blacked-out Wraith helicopters, stripped of all identification markings, screamed across the Philippine Sea, flying so low their rotors kicked up a localized hurricane of salt spray. In the lead bird, Nero sat by the open bay door, the wind whipping his hair into a chaotic crown. He wasn't wearing a headset. He was wearing the wool scarf Skye had left behind, wrapped tight around his lower face like a tactical mask. The sandalwood and ghost lily scent was his oxygen. It was the only thing keeping his alpha rage focused instead of blind. Boss thermal sensors show the solarium is reinforced. His pilot shouted over the roar. The automated turrets are locking on. Drop the chaff and bring us in hot, Nero commanded, his voice a gravelly promise of death. I don't want a tactical entry. I want a crater. The golden aviary's defense systems roared to life. Surface-to-air missiles streaked into the sky, but Nero's fleet was piloted by men who had nothing left to lose. One helicopter took a hit to the tail rotor, spinning out and crashing into the surf, but the other 2 slammed onto the marble helipads. Nero was the first out. He didn't take cover. He moved with a terrifying rhythmic violence, his twin .45s barking in a steady cadence. Every syndicate guard who stepped into his path was met with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. He wasn't just fighting for an Omega, he was fighting for the only part of himself that felt human. Inside the estate, The air had become a biohazard. Skye's overclocked scent had bypassed the ventilation filters. Guards were dropping to their knees, their tactical masks useless against a pheromone that didn't just enter the lungs, it entered the pores. Alphas who had spent their lives suppressing their instincts were suddenly hit with a legendary command to submit. Some were vomiting. Others were staring at the walls in a catatonic euphoria. Nero felt it too. As he breached the inner sanctum, the scent of the ghost lily hit him like a physical wall. His heart hammered against his ribs, his vision swimming with gold. His inner alpha screamed at him to drop his weapons, to kneel, to give in to the intoxicating peace of the flower. He bit his tongue until he tasted copper. He used the pain to anchor himself. Skye. Nero roared, his voice echoing through the marble halls. He reached the solarium doors. They were locked from the inside, 6 inches of reinforced polycarbonate. Nero didn't call for a breach charge. He emptied his magazines into the hinges and then threw his entire body weight against the center. The glass spiderwebbed. Through the cracks, he saw Skye. Skye was strapped into the medical chair, his skin pale, his eyes rolled back, but the aura radiating from him was a shimmering, visible heat haze. The main collector was huddled in the corner, his expensive haptic lenses shattered on the floor. His hands clawing at his own throat as he tried to breathe air that had become 90% ghost lily. Get away. From him, Nero gasped, his lungs burning. He kicked the door in, the glass showering the room like diamonds. Nero stumbled toward the chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the restraints. He was fading, the scent was too strong, even for him. He was at the epicenter of a biological supernova. Skye, Nero whispered, collapsing to his knees beside the chair, his forehead resting against Skye's arm. Stop. You're going to burn your heart out. Stop. At the sound of Nero's voice, the gold haze in the room flickered. Skye's eyes focused. The suffocating sweetness began to recede, leaving only the raw, jagged scent of 2 people who had pushed themselves to the edge of extinction. Chapter 14. The silence that followed the dissipation of the scent was deafening. The air in the solarium was thick, ionized, and tasted of copper. Skye's chest heaved as the biological overclock receded, leaving him trembling and hollow. Nero didn't wait for his own vision to clear. His fingers, scarred and steady, despite the tremor in his lungs, found the manual release on the medical chair. The silk-lined restraints snapped open. Skye collapsed forward, and Nero caught him, his massive arms wrapping around the Omega like a suit of armor. For a heartbeat, they simply breathed into each other. Asphalt, cedar, sandalwood, and ghost lily swirling into a singular, bruised harmony. I told you to stay. In the car, Nero rasped against Skye's hair. I don't have a car. On an island, Skye whispered back, his fingers clutching Nero's tactical vest. A wet, hacking cough sounded from the corner. The main collector was dragging himself upright, using a marble pedestal for support. His face was a map of broken capillaries, his eyes bloodshot from the pheromone toxicity. In his hand, he gripped a small, sleek detonator. You think? You've won. The collector wheezed, a frantic, jagged grin stretching his lips. This island is a laboratory. If I can't have the lineage, no one will. The Golden Aviary has a thermal purge protocol. In 5 minutes, this entire facility will be a kill. Nero went still. His hand moved to his holster. But it was empty. His weapons had been discarded in the final push to reach the chair. The data is already uploaded to the cloud. The collector laughed, his thumb hovering over the red toggle. Your legend will be a ghost again by morning. And you, Nero, you'll just be the man who burned for a smell. Nero started to, lunged, but Skye's hand on his chest stopped him. Skye stood up. He was pale, leaning on Nero for support, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of a victim. It was the look of the last of a predatory line. You spent your whole life trying to bottle me, Skye said, his voice ringing with a cold, crystalline clarity. "But you forgot one thing about the ghost lily." Skye took a step forward, away from Nero's shadow. He didn't flood the room this time. He did something far more surgical. Kay focused every ounce of his remaining strength into a singular, directed spike of scent, a concentrated needle of ghost lily aimed directly at the collector. The Alpha's pupils dilated instantly. His thumb froze on the detonator, his nervous system hijacked by a command to freeze. In that half-second of biological paralysis, Nero moved like a blur of charcoal and steel. Nero's fist connected with the collector's jaw with the force of a sledgehammer. The detonator clattered across the floor. Before the man could even hit the ground, Nero had scooped up the device, crushing it in his palm. "Jox is on the docks," Nero said, grabbing Skye's hand and hauling him toward the shattered glass wall. "The Wraith is hovering. We have 3 minutes before the backup timers kick in." They didn't run like a boss and an asset. They ran as two halves of a whole. Nero shielded Skye from the falling debris as the island's self-destruct sequence began to rumble in the foundations. As they leaped into the open bay of the hovering helicopter, the solarium erupted in a pillar of white-hot flame. The golden aviary was being purged, but the treasure had already flown. In the back of the chopper, surrounded by the smell of cordite and salt, Skye slumped against Nero's chest. Nero wrapped his coat and the scent-soaked scarf around them both. "It's over," Nero said, his voice a low rumble. "No," Skye replied, looking at the marks on his own wrists where the silk had bitten. "The hunt is over. We're just beginning." Chapter 15. The waves of the Pacific were no longer a barrier. They were a sanctuary. 6 months had passed since the sky over the Philippine Sea turned orange with the destruction of the golden aviary. The scent syndicate had been decapitated. Its ledgers leaked to every major enforcement agency by a ghost programmer rumored to be working for a dead man. Nero's new stronghold wasn't a bunker. It was a glass and steel villa perched on a cliffside in a sovereign territory the law couldn't quite reach. Here, the air didn't smell of ozone or fear. It smelled of salt, jasmine, and the steady, grounding presence of rain-soaked asphalt. In the sleek home office, Jox, scarred but very much alive, tapped a tablet screen. The last of the collectors just filed for bankruptcy in Geneva. The bounty on Skye's head has been officially retracted. No one wants to touch the ghost lily lineage anymore. Not after what happened to the island. Nero sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, his sleeves rolled up. He looked younger, the jagged tension in his shoulders replaced by a quiet, lethal confidence. And the synthetic labs. "Shut down," Jox grinned. "Turns out you can't replicate the soul of a flower with a computer." They just ended up with expensive perfume that smelled like rot. Nero nodded, dismissing his lieutenant with a flick of his wrist. His focus shifted to the balcony, where a figure stood silhouetted against the setting sun. Skye was no longer the waif-like boy in the gossamer robe. He wore a simple white linen shirt, his skin tanned and his eyes bright with a sharp, observant intelligence. Around his neck there was no matte black collar. Instead, there was a faint, jagged scar where the needles had once been, and over it, a dark, permanent bite mark. Nero's mark. Nero stepped onto the balcony, his large hand coming to rest on the small of Skye's back. He didn't have to say anything. The air between them was a conversation. The sandalwood and ghost lily was no longer a leak or a weapon. It was a soft, steady hum, a scent of contentment that only flared when Nero was near. "You're thinking about the auction," Nero murmured, his nose brushing against Skye's temple. "I'm thinking about the glass," Skye replied, leaning back into the solid warmth of Nero's chest. "I used to think the only way to be safe was to be invisible, to be silent. And now?" Skye turned in Nero's arms, his fingers tracing the line of the Alpha's jaw. "Now I know that the only way to survive a world of predators is to find the one who makes the rest of them afraid." Nero looked out over the ocean. He had retired from the petty wars of the city's underworld. But he was still a king. Only now, he was a king with something to lose and something to live for. "They'll still come for us eventually," Nero said, his voice a low, protective purr. "New collectors, new syndicates. They'll always want the legend." Skye smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that mirrored Nero's own. He leaned in, his scent blooming not as a paralyzing shockwave, but as a promise. "Let them come," Skye whispered, pulling Nero down for a kiss that tasted of freedom and fire. "We aren't the last of our kind anymore. Nero, we're the beginning of a new one." The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. The ghost lily was no longer a myth to be hunted. It was a living, breathing reality, guarded by a man who had burned a world to keep it.